So I know some of your faces, so that you were here in 2016 when I gave this, but as I told Christy, that I don't give the same thing twice, so you'll get a slightly different version of it. As a matter of fact, it keeps adding to it. When she initially contacted me back then and asked that I speak on the topic, then I said, well, I have some information, but I will combine it with what I already know, and we'll go from there. Well, I ran into a whole lot of other information, and as a matter of fact, what I'm going to give you, there's a few things in here that I just put in an hour ago. So it's really up to date. Now, let's start from the very beginning. Do you think we could reduce some of the lights a little bit so you get a better image on the screen? Is there a way? Or if not, we can go.
There are a series of switches right over
If you
there.
can get the switch to turn off this light.
I don't know which one it is.
Well, we can
there
experiment.
are limits on what they can do, as it turns out.
Right? No? Well, that's the other room.
Oh,
Switch over there.
Those are the only three.
There. Oh, is that too dark? All right. Well, at least you'll have more attention on the screen here. Yes, Monee and Monee or Marie LeFevre Bailey. All right, is what you're reading. She lived from 1773 to 1866. But already there's some things I want to point out here. First of all, the photograph on your left is of an unidentified Potawatomi woman taken about 1906. You know, so it's not really her. The sketch is done by one of her descendants, Marie LeFevre, and we don't know if that, but actually the two photographs kind of match, don't they? They kind of, the drawing and the photograph kind of look alike. But we can start off, and I'm going to teach you a little French in the process, because the family spoke French and whatnot. So it's not Bailey, it's Bailly. It's like B-A-Y-E-E. How about you saying it? Bailly.
Bailly.
Bailly is really the last name. Okay, now this is really from an early website that was put up here in Monee, and it gives us some of the basic facts. That it was founded by Augustus Herbert in November 1853. It was recorded in the Will County Courthouse, and Herbert recorded his plot of land on the 25th of November. But the lore and legend says that the village is named for a French Ottawa Indian woman, Marie LeFevre Bailly. She was the daughter of a French fur trader and was half French, half Ottawa Indian woman. In other words, she was a Métis, M-E-T-I-S. She was a mixed blood. Right. An Indian princess, Marie was renowned as one of the most beautiful women in the Northwest Mackinac Island area. So I think that's a 19th century attribution to simply a beautiful woman. Her father died when she was 8 years old, and her mother took her to live with Indian relatives at L'Arbre Croche, which we'll get there. While young Marie was called Marie, or you say Mary, Marie, by the French, the Ottawa had no sound corresponding with the letter R, and thus called the little girl Monee, and the French treaty clerk later wrote it down as Monee. So I don't think she actually went by Monee at all. But anyway, in 1833, the Treaty of Camp Tippecanoe with the Potawatomi, actually I think it's with the Treaty of Chicago, resulted in a gift of property to the 4 daughters of Marie and her husband, Joseph Bailly. The tract encompassed what is now Raccoon Grove, otherwise known as Coon Grove, around the intersection of Egyptian Trail and Pauline Road, being the center of the 1,280 acres. It's not clear, however, according to this author, why the site in eastern Will County was chosen as a gift to the girls, unless Bailly foresaw that somewhere at the end of Lake Michigan, a great commercial center would develop. This gift of property is possibly the only link between Princess Monee and the village named in her honor. the first mayor, William Ogden, who we will visit, purchased the reservation from the Bailly family in 1851 for $5 an acre. The village of Monee was incorporated in 1874, and the court hall was built and served as a municipal building. And there's other things too having to do with the railroad, because actually the first use of the word Monee was the North Central Railroad stop here. And then there was a kind of a, what do they call, silo or storage bin there, right at that particular stop. So it became, the name Monee became well marked as this railroad stop. Okay, if we can go on to the next one. Now let me see, how do you get to Monee in the 1830s or earlier? You know? That's a little something to solve first, to say why here? Well, a prairie, which again another French word for meadow, is an open grassland with no trees. The plants in a prairie are a mix of native grasses and forbs, or wildflowers, as you see on the left. Now really what the real word we should be using is not prairie, but it's a savanna, because a savanna landscape is a hybrid of prairie and woodland, often occurring at the transition zone where the two natural communities gain and cede territory to one another, depending on the frequency of fire, which drives back, the trees and the brush. Scattered trees or an occasional cluster of trees in a savanna are usually thick-barked species that can withstand the occasional fire, such as bur oak. Next one. Now, the next thing to remember is a grove. Grove is a wooded area that drew both Native Americans and first settlers. And the first communities, other than those located in large rivers or on large rivers or Lake Michigan, were at the edge of these timbered groves. There are many examples. Big Grove near Urbana, Rantoul's Mink Grove, Bloomington's Blooming Grove. There's Villa Grove, Elk Grove, Downers Grove, Goodnow Grove, Thorn or Thorn Creek Grove, Franklin Grove, Deer Grove, Long Grove, and finally Raccoon Grove. I missed Skunk Grove, which is really the Hickory Creek area. The groves were like little islands. The prairie was not a very hospitable place. It was too hot in the summer and too cold in the winter. And of course there were swarms of mosquitoes and biting flies. In the summer there's no shade. Now the woodland Indians would not live in the open prairie. They would live in at least partially shaded areas. Groves were predominantly made up of oak trees, while the bottomlands and wet areas had hackberry, sycamore, cottonwood, and other species. The most common shrub of the landscape was the American hazel, which has declined even more than the oak hickory woods in the absence of fire. Prevailing winds in Illinois are from the west and southwest, and groves and other large timbered areas were located mostly on the east and north sides of marshes, creeks, streams, sloughs, and other water features. Frequent fires, which occurred naturally from lightning strikes and were purposely set by Native Americans as a hunting aid, kept trees from invading the prairie. Fire also kept trees such as sugar maple and basswood in check in the timbered areas. Bur oak, an iconic trees of the prairie, is well adapted to fire because of its thick, cork-like bark. And white oak is another one that resists. So you notice the map of Illinois, where you have these green areas, which are effectively forests that begin to creep out, certainly along the water courses, but also dot the areas. The next one, please. Now, animal trails are another way here. We're getting closer to it. Animal trails, of course, the animals that are living in the groves venture out, into the prairie a bit, but then hide, from hawks and other predatory birds and animals. And actually the groves are the ones that are filled with the animals, because the smaller animals seek refuge there and the other predators come in after them. So in one sense, groves, are that. Also you get just So larger animals, deer tracks and whatnot, forming other trails. And then you get others, especially connected up with the bison, the buffalo, which create almost roadways. The next one there. So if you're getting through the woods, you know, it's an animal trail. And of course, Native Americans would follow these animal trails, not only for good hunting, but also getting across the landscape. So the first intelligent beings, really the animals, they sometimes knew the quickest, you know, way to get between two places, avoid the marshes, stick to the high ground, and then so you get human trails following animal trails in the next. All right, and so so some trails are quite, especially if they're used quite often, you know, or they've had buffalo on them. And you did have buffalo here in Illinois. In fact, as far as up north as southern Michigan. And so you get trails like this that, you know, they'd be fairly easy to follow even at night. And what's characteristic of trails is that a trail, of course, when it does get muddy, there'll be another branch of it. And so there's not just one trail. There's, you know, there's a little bypasses and whatnot that carry it through. And over time, you know, you would take the most convenient one, so it's not a single roadway. But this business of the buffalo being here is something we often don't think about. The first thoroughfares were traces made by the deer and the bison in their seasonal migrations between feeding grounds, streams, and salt licks. And many of these routes followed the watersheds and crested ridges to avoid summer muck, the flies of the swamp, and winter snowdrifts. And of course, these were the paths that they used getting places. Now in Chicago, some of the main streets are still following the old trails, both animal and then Native American trails. Streets that, in other words, because of their twisted pattern, when they put the surveyor's grid on top of it with its 80 and 40 and 20 acre lots fitting into a nice checkerboard pattern, these streets, of course, defy that, which is a good sign that they're earlier. We have here William Scharf's map of Indian trails in the Chicago region as of 1804, although it wasn't published until about 1930. And you have a whole network of both village sites and trails in the Chicago area. Now, one particular trail, is of particular, it's right at the bottom, skirts the bottom of the image here, namely the Sauk Trail. Now the Sauk Trail was a trail that went across in this area from Joliet all the way over into Indiana, the area around Dyer. But it went through New Lenox and what is now Frankfort, and it went down through what is Richton Park and Park Forest, and headed on. And this was a major overland trail that went all the way from the Mississippi to Detroit. And Detroit was on the way to Fort Malden on the other side of the river, which was the British headquarters until the War of 1812 or beyond that. Through this area, it went through the whole slew of counties here. And in our area, of course, is just in this area. Now, it's largely covered by various roadways today, but there is a stretch of it where you see Harlem Avenue and Laraway Road, which begins here, and then Sauk Trail really is here, winding into Frankfort. And of course, the surveyors and whatnot, and possibly early farmers, they wanted everything to go north, south, east, west. And so, but here you have a remnant. And so this probably went something like this, didn't face this, but connected this way and then meandered down generally. And this little patch of it in the winter, going through that field at the corner of Sauk Trail in Harlem, you can almost see, you know, where it's the kind of the washout, and of course the farmer growing grasses there to keep it from to having further erosion. And that, to me, is the only remnant you have of the trail in this immediate area. Now, as it goes through Frankfort, it's going through the woods right above Hickory Creek, and you see it here. It says the Indian Trail, Sauk Trail going through it. And just as I'll show you the Monee and her daughter's grant here in Raccoon Grove, there are Indian grants there in, this used to be called Skunk Grove. Let's try it on the side, we can read it. Skunk Grove on Hickory Creek, where 320 acres are reserved for, you know, in the 1833 treaty to a Maui Tokwa, and in other words, then to the wife of Maui Tokwa, and then to the children of Joseph LeFramboise. Now, Joseph LeFramboise was the son of a very Madeleine Framboise, a very famous fur trading lady who had her headquarters on Mackinac Island, and I'll show you even her grave there. All right. Also to the wife of Joseph LeFramboise. Now, LeFramboise, or basically is the French word for raspberries. So, but also the trail goes through the area over here. In other words, this area in the south of the lake, gets close to the lake, and then goes up and crosses the St. Joseph River here in Michigan. And when Marie Bailly and her husband Joseph first came down to the area, they moved into the area called Parc aux Vaches, which is near Bertrand, Michigan, or just south of Niles. And Parc aux Vaches means the kind of a field or of cows, but the cows they're talking about are buffalo. So you had buffalo up to the St. Joseph River. Here's looking at it closer here. Now the Chicago Road is following the Sauk Trail. And so the St. Joseph River area. All right. This is the Bertrands, the Joseph Bertrand and Madeleine Bertrand at Parc aux Vaches, Bertrand, Michigan, or Niles. And they settled in 1808, and just a couple of years later, Joseph Bailly purchased 2 large cabins, several log structures, and wigwams from a John Kinsey, another friend of his, 1804, which we can get to too. But this is showing you a little bit of the trail coming together and in that area of the. But the trails are all over the area in this Calumet area, and of course the later on the Baillis have their establishment trading post here near Porter, Indiana, or what is now, as we'll see, the National Lakeshore there. In fact, you can go to the homestead in the dunes area. Let me get oriented here. Where are we?
Down.
Let's see.
Right.
Oh yeah, the Shellberg Farm and the Bailly Shellberg Visitor Center with the home right there. It's right off Highway 12. It's tucked away in the woods, and it's a structure that they built following the War of 1812. There's the north thing. Now this is now called the Indiana Dunes National Park. As of February this present year, it was designated a national park. Also the interesting post office, in other words, the mail route in 1831 lists the, over there on the far left, the Bailly homestead there as a mailing thing. In other words, a stop for the mail heading on to Detroit. But showing you other things too about this area was interesting because a little bit to the east of here, of course, there were a lot of trails that went into the Kankakee Marsh. And if you, there's even there's something on a video that's around on the famous Kankakee Marsh, which is a major inland area that for all sorts of birds and whatnot, migrations, which of course was drained now and turned into farmland, and now parts of it there's attempt to restore it. Also up into Michigan, you got the Old Sauk Trail that goes to Detroit, and there's the St. Joseph Trail and others that even go down the backbone of Michigan and across the Upper Peninsula. Then there's the Vincennes Trail, and the Vincennes Trail was Hubbard made famous in 1822, moving his trade goods on back ponies from his 80-acre farm on the Iroquois River south along an old buffalo trace. So this, of course, follows state route number 1, the northern end of Chicago. But then when you get to these fur traders trading, they're not walking the trail. They're riding horses and ponies. And when they're traveling on the lake, it's not probably by canoe anymore, but some kind of a small craft with a sail. So you have to make the little bit of shift in terms of, like the War of 1812, a lot of the Native Americans engaged in that where they had horses at home. Now this area, how to get then to Raccoon Grove. And my point is, well, follow a road that twists and turns. And what's an interesting one? It's Old Sauk Trail here, Old Monee Road rather. Old Monee Road twists and whatnot from the Sauk Trail and heads right this way, all the way to the Creek Monee Road, just due immediately to the east of here. And, well, how do you get it? Well, this yellow line is mine, right? This is an interesting trail following it to Raccoon Grove Nature Preserve. And from there all the way down to the headwaters of the Rock River. And why would we be interested in there? Because Joseph Bailly had a trading center from about 1808 to almost 1819 at Kankakee, what is now the state park. And my guess is where it is right near that platform you get on in the Kankakee at the main entrance there. When you go on the river, and there's the Rock River comes out just on the other side, and then there's an interesting suspension bridge which you can walk across. Well, because there's a very nice spring there. It's one of the nicest sites right on the Kankakee River, right in the Kankakee State Park. So, in other words, so Joseph Bailly, as I said, had a trading post, 1808 to 1828. And it's getting close to 1833, where the property in Raccoon Grove is dedicated to Monee and her 5 daughters. So why is it here? It's because he probably took that trail back and forth. Also, too, the Baillys were very famous hosts to various other Native American groups, especially Ottawa and Potawatomi in the area. And they may have claimed it as a place so that the Native Americans could temporarily stay there because they were always on the move seasonally. Groups would go further to the south in the winter months and then go back up north to various food sources and animal populations, in the summer months, or fishing sites. If you look at this 1864 map, you see here the Raccoon Grove, and this, of course, is long after the 1833 treaty. And how all these little properties are divided up in the grove. People wanted a timber source, or they wanted to get out of the sun. And so some of the first inhabitants in this area are in the grove. They moved into the trees just like they were up on the Thorn Grove, which was probably even earlier than here. Here's the 1873 township map, which shows you Raccoon Grove, Monee, and then the Thorn Woods up here. And it shows you, of course, the old Monee Road that runs all the way, you know, it's pretty much like as it does today. Now, there were many Native American groups in the area that go way back. And a lecture I went to a couple years ago by the archaeologist Michelle Laurie in the Sanctuary Golf Club site on Hickory Creek. They unearthed a very late prehistoric and possibly early historic village site. And they excavated, there were a few graves there as well, and there are different things they found of European trade goods. But of the one image that she had, which I haven't not been able to get a hold of yet, but it showed something like the size of a football field. And they'd stripped the soil apart, and you could see the fireplaces. In other words, the campfire things. In other words, dotting these things. Like maybe about 100 different fire scorched areas, you know, that were in the ground of this particular village site. A fairly large village. Other things, of course, is the Hoxie farm site up in what do we call that?
South Allen.
Pardon?
It's in Thornton. It's in Thornton. Right? It's in Thornton.
Yeah, Thornton. It's in Thornton. It's the I was trying to think. Wampum Lake. Yes, at Wampum Lake. There's nothing to be seen on the surface now, but it too was a major site in the area. And as I said, all these places, you know, had some access to the Great Kankakee Marsh more further down. Now, this is the Indian boundary line. Land included between the strips, a strip 20 miles wide, was surveyed in 1821-22. The Indian title having been extinguished from this in a treaty of 1818. They wanted this for canal purposes. And in 1833, of course, the Potawatomi signed a treaty in Chicago ceding more lands. And in 1835, they all were removed from this area. Kankakee River showing you, as I say, here's a Rock Creek coming in on the far left. And right around that area, I think, is really probably my guesstimate of where the Bailey fur trading post was, rather than having it down at Davis Creek, which is a nice area, but that's quite a park there, a favorite of mine. Okay, back to Marie LeFevre de la Vigne. All right, that was when her first marriage, when she had several children. Her given name Marie, surname LeFevre de la Vigne, and then Monee, of course, and then Tusaqua, or her Indian name Wing Woman. Mm-hmm. Right. Marie LeFevre was born in Ottawa in a Potawatomi village, according to this, in the St. Joseph Band. So back to Niles, Michigan here. In 1817, she testified that her deceased father, named LeFevre, had been a tradesman and a merchant, and then contradicting the statement by describing her deceased mother as a sauvage, an Indian woman with having no exposure to French-speaking people. Her first husband was this Kaugoma, also called Levine. He was reported that he was a medicine man in the Mackinac Band of Ottawa, who died between 1804 and 1809. At the time of her marriage to Joseph Bailly in 1810, she was considered to be a widow of the Mackinac Band of Ottawa. Now, this is all the documented things we have on her, where her birth, where she was at Rivière-au-Raisin, which is really near Monroe, Michigan. And then her christening was in the records of this Catholic Mission of Saint Antoine. And then there's, and I'll show it to you in a moment, a very confusing thing about her furniture and household goods of a value of 150 pounds from Drummond Island in 1817. Then there's these Indian grants that were given, one in Porter County, another one in Tippecanoe, still another one here in 1832, where then she's listed as postmistress in 1855. And then there's another Porter County grant, and then petitions to Congress done in her favor. And then Marshall County, Indiana, another Indian grant. And then the one here in Will County, where she sold land, consists of 1,280 acres. This is Raccoon Grove here. Here's listed in 1853. And then there's another grants come her way, and then she died as a result of a fall on the ice near her home in Porter, Indiana. And then she's buried there in the Bayou Cemetery in the Indiana Dunes. That's the things. But here, there's a marker here near Monroe, Michigan, of this first place, the Saint Antoine, on the river Au Raisin. Raisin, of course, means grapes. And it's the church that was originally there. And it was kind of an interesting French-Indian community. Now we know a fair amount about her. Her granddaughter, Frances R. Howe, wrote this book, A Story of the French Homestead in the Old Northwest. And this is Frances Howe and her daughters in both of these pictures. And she gives a version of it. And there's an interesting novel written by another of the Bailly descendants, by a Julia Cooley Atroci, called Wolves Against the Moon. And they're quite an interesting read. Now, they don't always agree. This, of course, is fiction, historical fiction, and she does take some liberties, but it's largely based on some of the skeletal information here. This one is very much a very religious lady, and she couches things in religious terms, but interesting combination of information on our Monee. Well, the Ottawa, or Ottawa today, population were really the Mackinac Indians. The Mackinac Indians that lived there on Mackinac Island and on both the Upper Peninsula and the Lower Peninsula, Mackinac City. And gradually they went to L'Arbe Croche, which is further down near, well, I'll take you there in a moment. But the Ottawa means traitor. And the Ottawa were people of the Three Fires. The Three Fires meaning the Ottawa, the Potawatomi, and the Ojibwe or Chippewa. The three, so they all related. They all were speaking Algonquin language, and very close together, and even closer than Romantic languages in Europe. And as I say, some of the red points here shows you where they end up. There's a kind of reserves for them in Michigan, but also up in Ontario. They're on the top of Lake Huron. But these are Ottawa Indians from L'Arbe Croche near Benton Harbor. They were not living in wigwams, but log cabins here from about the, well, fairly early on, certainly into before the 1800s. And the Ottawa had married in with the French. So when you say you're Ottawa French, that is, say your father was French and your mother was Ottawa, well, your mother probably had French ancestors before that, right? So they were mixed, very mixed. And the granddaughter has something to say about that when we get to it. Yet, this is a petition signed by a number of the Ottawas at L'Arbe Croche to President James Monroe, asking for a Catholic missionary, and this was dated in 1823. They had them back into the 1760s, when the Jesuit missions were pulled out, even before the English were there. And then, of course, later on. And so there hadn't been, a Catholic missionary in the area for, a good generation. And this is the sign of each one of them signing with their clan totem in this letter to President Monroe. This is showing you the church at L'Arbre Croche and the Indian cemetery. And the granddaughter talks about a number of the cabins were put in such a way on this reservation that they were kind of facing one another, and they'd even have like a communal fire in the middle. And a lot of them had open porches all facing each other to shield themselves from the winds. It's an interesting place to stop, even today, if you're riding up towards Mackinac. This is, of course, from some kind of a reenactment in 1910 of at Harbor Springs, an Ottawa tribe. Yet, according to the stories of both of them, not all of the Indians there, some of them were very much, westernized and Christianized, and yet others held back to the indigenous religion. In fact, the reason that Monee separated from her first husband, and the reason that Joseph Bailly separated from his first wife, is because they both were going became Native American practitioners. In other words, they were going back to the Indian religion, and there was enough tensions in either case that both of those marriages broke up. Now, some of the early people that came into the scene, both at L'Arbre Croche and later, is Gabriel Richard, who was the pastor of a church in Detroit, and he was all over the Great Lakes. He was the only priest there for a number of years. And Frederick Barraga, from 1832, he came all the way from what is now Yugoslavia area, actually he's Slovene, and he was a missionary at L'Arbre Croche, and then moved up and became the first bishop of the Diocese of Marquette, Sault Ste. Marie and then Marquette. But most everything in the early period was focused on Mackinac Island. This is a painting of the fort in 1761. And not only that, but all the fur traders had their cabins right here along the sheltered bay where they could store the furs to be shipped back to Montreal as the main income in the area. The early mission church of St. Anne's had been transported log by log across the Lake Michigan to Mackinac Island from what is now Mackinac City. But the trading, and Joseph Bailly was a fur trader, and he not only on Mackinac Island, but at Parc aux Vaches near Niles, also on the Manistee River, on the Kalamazoo River, on the St. Joseph River, on the Kankakee River, and then also in the area around Vincennes. Later on, he started off connected up with a Northwest Trading fur company, and then became an independent trader, and then later on was affiliated with the American Fur Trading Company. So there's a lot of fur trading stories connected with him, some of them very hair-raising, where they would bale the furs. And why the furs? Well, it's the hats. The fur trade was all about felt hats. And in the 18th and 19th century, well, the styles changed, but they still were making felt from the smaller hairs of the beaver, mainly. But when silk hats come in the 1830s, it killed it, because there was no more a market for the felt the way it had been. So when you think of those stovepipe hats, the first ones were made out of felt, but then they were made out of silk and some kind of an asphalt that was, to make it hard, and with a kind of a silk wrapping around it. So fur trade was all about hats, really. This, of course, Fort Dearborn was to protect the fur trade and early American presence here at the mouth of the Chicago River. The Potawatomi, of course, were in the area. And the Battle of 1812, rather the War of 1812, of course, had the fort was taken and burnt down. Actually, some of the soldiers and settlers had been taken captive, were later ransomed. I think about 50 people were killed. This is basically where it was, right here at the mouth of the river, with Kinsey's cabin on the other side. We'll see that eventually here. And you see a shoreline trail that's heading along. What they were doing is they evacuated the area. Here's the Fort Dearborn as of 1808. As I say, it was attacked by Potawatomi on August 15th of 1812 in the war against Britain, of course. The British had given prices on scalps to be taken of Americans, and some of the Indians, I think under the influence of alcohol and whatnot, worked themselves up, and this is the near Prairie Avenue today, which then was sand dunes, where the wagon trains were overwhelmed by the Indians, and people were taken and killed. But this is what I referred to as the Drummond Island. Since Joseph Bailly and Marie LeFevre were married in 1810, here we have something in 1817 that Joseph, declares and confesses to lawfully owe Marie LeFevre, daughter of LeFevre deceased, formerly tradesmen and merchants, and of a savage woman, the sum of 150 pounds, Halifax rate, for a value received in salary and wages during her stay at his house in the quality of a maidservant, owing also for some clothes and money given by her to him many times, which sum he presently pays by selling and delivering to her before the undersigned notary all the furniture in his house, according to the list herewith. In other words, why would you list your wife as your maidservant and then you have a notary document, giving her the furniture? Strange. All right. Well, I will show you other strange things that happened. This is the Treaty of with the Potawatomi, 1832. And in the articles here, it gives, well, there's the things here on Thorn Creek, one's in yellow here. Second one here, the 5 daughters of Monee by her late husband, Joseph Bailly, 2 sections of land. And then, let's see, other people's on the Kankakee River, and interesting things. Now, this is the treaty with the Potawatomi. Monee was in Ottawa. What's she doing on an Ottawa treaty? Right. Unless Joseph Bailly had his name, and the same thing went with the LeFevre. You put family members in the way of you getting paid for acting as an interpreter. The treaty, that's one possibility. Now the granddaughter of Monee here says that sometimes the Indians would just put their friends in the treaty as a kind of recognition. Well, maybe so. But let's keep on going here. All right, so he educated his daughters, and he wanted to make sure they learned English. At home they spoke French and Potawatomi, according to this. All right. It says that she barely spoke French, a language which she understood when spoken slowly and deliberately, and always retained the dress of an Aborigine. Yeah, she kept wearing an Indian woman's dress with that silk patchwork design. She did this as a part of a vow she and her husband took to devote themselves to Christianizing the Potawatomi, in exchange for when she was, she had a very, when she was with child, of the son that he really wanted. Now this is the reservation here in Raccoon Grove. A reservation for the 5 daughters of Monee and to the husband of Joseph Bailly, and it goes on there. And it shows you the woods in green, and interesting, it shows you a water source coming out of it, flowing to the south. It doesn't show you the Monee Reservoir or Lake Downs, which was off to the west of it, because that was dug later by the railroad. They needed water for the trains, and so that comes later. So it's interesting that now this land was sold in 1853 by the Baillis, but look at this. This is from the Monee Township Assessor's Book, which you can access to on the internet, 1852, Raccoon Grove. All these people were squatting there. In other words, what Ogden was doing is clearing the title. In other words, the place was well occupied by all these white settlers that already moved in, right? And then I put the little blue arrows where his name is there, with William Ogden, who purchased the Bailly land. But these other people were all there. He had the bigger lots, as you can see. But sometimes, you know, as you see, even later on, you have all these little lot squares still, you know, in the federal census of 1860. And this one, the Illinois Central going through, and they cut into the edge of the Raccoon Grove. And these are the original farmers in the area in 1873. Yeah, I already mentioned about the railroad there. Well, now I was really interested if this is the surveyor's photograph, land survey of photograph from 1939, the earliest aerial photos taken of the area. And you can see here the way that the old Monee Road's coming down, and then it straightens out, and it gets, of course, the Creek Road. And you wonder, is there something else going here? Would there be a trail that would go here and end up here at Raccoon Grove? If so, I can't find it. I don't know what this is. Certainly it wouldn't go way over there. But anyway, I must say I'm intrigued with these maps, especially aerial maps, and to see. Also, we do know, though, the early farms here in Monee, closer to the town, were dairy farms. They were not for growing crops because the soil, this is being one of the highest points in Illinois, the soil here is very clay, and it's only good black dirt to the east and the west of the township. But so you probably an awful lot of cattle that would roaming all over, and they form their own things. So you're not going to see any remnants, I think, of trails on the map, but it's fun to look. All right, this is a little bit more modern survey of it. But the question is, did Marie LeFevre Bailly ever visit Raccoon Grove? Probably not, because of the birth of her daughters and sons. Her daughter Esther was born in 1811, daughter Rose, 1813, Eleanor, 1815, and then their first son, 1817, and then Hortense. A little confusion on just where she was born. But if he was here, you know, both in the Kankakee area, both before and after the War of 1812, she'd be too busy at home with her kids to be pony riding, I think, in Raccoon Grove. But certainly he did. He did. And he must have liked it enough to want to hold on. Now, this is a letter written by the granddaughter of Marie LeFevre Bailly and published to the publisher of her sister's memoirs. And it tells you a little bit more. And it gives you a little light on that Indian princess stuff. I am pleased to be able to contradict the statement that my grandmother was a Potawatomi. Such an idea would be enough to disturb the peace of her last repose. Did she know of it? She hated the Potawatomis with a perfect hatred, disliked their costume, well, she wore it, disapproved of their customs, considered their dialect a more detestable jargon, and thought her own mother tongue the opposite of all that was abominable in the Potawatomi language. I can well remember her outspoken disgust at their idioms, which she did not refrain from expressing before them, even though she knew she would give offense. Her father was a French gentleman, a trader by the name of LeFevre. He had a trading post first in one part of Michigan, then in another, notably near St. Clair River. Be it remembered that was then Canadian territory. Her mother was a woman of the Ottawa tribe, Canadian Indians, who had their principal camping grounds near the Ottawa River and whose extreme western limits was the northeastern shore of Lake Michigan. Mr. LeFevre did not desert his wife, but after his death, his widow returned to her people and her own immediate relatives in the vicinity of Mackinac with her two girls, Marie and Angelique. It was supposed that, Joseph Bailly adopted the two daughters. It was supposed that they had been baptized through their father's care, but that is not certain. When my grandmother made profession of the Christian religion in the Catholic Church, she was baptized conditionally, a phrase which a priest will explain. In other words, perhaps she was baptized before, christened before. My grandmother never had an Indian name. Well, we know it differently. So, let's see. And she mentioned she met and married my grandfather in the vicinity where they resided. And then Samuel Abbott, being the officiating clergyman, actually he was a big fur entrepreneur. I have observed the Ottawa Indians were Canadian Indians. Let's see. So she goes on and talks about the mixture of the French with the Indian blood, and they had French facial features. And she goes on. They were different from the Potawatomi, who lived in bark huts or wigwams made of bulrush matting, while the Ottawa lived in log cabins, much as on a plan of on a plantation. So the Potawatomi kept company with the lower classes, but the young folks had not a word to say of the matter of their marriage. They were given away by parents or friends. All right, so she's making some comparisons here. Well, she obviously has an axe to grind, and because she was not accepted even in Porter, Indiana. She talks about some of the neighboring kids rapping on the windows and hollering at her that she was an Indian and she was a squaw. And so I think her whole life she was trying to regain the prestige that Joseph Bailly had with Marie on that earlier colonial frontier. So I think you go from up and down, back and forth. If you have Native American Indian, are you proud of it or are you ashamed of it? You know, and I think it goes back and forth with the styles. And then, of course, the idea of princess would be an adulation. Okay. Well, this is the only sketch we have, a watercolor drawing of Joseph Bailly, Porter County's first white settler. It was a drawing by the daughter Rose of her father. This is the Bailly or Bailey homestead. Of course, the porches were added later. And the building was actually built only a couple of years before he died. This is the other side of it. There are other log cabins on it, and even a brick home. But that's even later, 1874. And you can see this when you go there. National Park Service. We were there, my wife and I were there for a maple sugar tapping festival, which was held on the grounds. Also there's what they call the Indian Chapel. Other things, though, they describe of using the front room and rooms in the house as a church for both the Potawatomi Indians as well as some of the other people in the area. Then there's the Bailly Cemetery, and that's about a half a mile away. And it was originally kind of the crest of a hill. And there's some indigenous burials there too of Native Americans, you know, that are late, prehistoric, that were buried there. And then he buried his son and put up a big cross and then a little cabin as a shelter. And then other relatives were put in there. And they put in even stations of the cross of having to do with Jesus' road to Calvary around the inside walls. And then other people were buried there, including even Swedish settlers that were neighbors of there. They invited them to bury them in their cemetery. But then with the granddaughter, when she took over the property, she actually had some graves removed. She wanted to make the Bailly Cemetery just for family. And so they had this wall not only built, but like today, the whole interior of it is filled with sand. So in other words, they've taken some, or they've reproduced the information on the tombstones around the edges of it. And these are all the people we know that were buried there. Some of them were infants and whatnot of neighbors and whatnot. So it's buried in that particular cemetery. But here you have Joseph Bailly and his wife, Marie LeFevre, and their dates on one of the main slabs and around the cemetery. The other things, you can get a lot more detail on his life, which I won't go through, but and also his children by his first marriage, an Angelique Ngulpan, the daughter of an Indian and Scottish fur trader, and then their children. Now, some of their children are quite prominent. One of the daughters is Eleanor Bailly, became Mother Mary Cecilia Bailly of the Sisters of Providence of St. Mary of the Woods College. She became not just head of the orphanage, but she became head of the order and was very much involved. In fact, her writings of the woman who founded that particular order, one of her things had been actually used by the Vatican, having to do with a canonization of the founder of that order. And then the other one, Marie Esther, and she married a prominent fellow in Chicago, Whistler, and she died in childbirth. And then sons here of, Joseph Bailly's son Francis, by the previous marriage, was a early French fur trader, and he settled in the Grand River area. But then Alex Bailey, early fur trader in Mendota, Minnesota, and he was in the House of Representatives there in a big political thing. And of course many other descendants, but these are the ones I was able to find photographs of. Well, where do we go? Descendants, lots of descendants of those people. These are his ancestors, a very prominent family in Quebec. In fact, he had an uncle who was a coadjutor bishop of Quebec. He tried to found a town just near Porter, what they call Bailey Town, but the whole thing died out in 1835 when he died. He was trying to recruit actually some French settlers from Canada to settle here in near Porter, Indiana, on the Calumet River. Good friends of his is the Kinsey Mansion, which had been the DuSable House near Fort Dearborn on the Chicago River. And here's Kinsey, who was a very close friend and fellow fur trader, and always stopping. Another is Shabona, maybe you've heard of Shabona, an Ottawa Potawatomi chief here. He was born in an Indian village on the Kankakee River, and but he too is related to Monee through her father's side, through the French side of the family. But there's a lot of things commemorating him. Let's see, I don't want to go through that. Portions of Thorn Creek Division are named after him, Shabona Woods, to commemorate him. And then the woman I promised, Madeleine LeFevre, the woman fur trader. And the one, the rags to riches stories. She was very close friends of the Baillis, of Marie or Monee. In fact, one of the daughters, Sophia, from his first marriage, she adopted her. And so Madeleine LeFevre adopted one of the Bailey children and raised her on Mackinac Island. The house that she lived in, the residence of Madame LeFevre, is now Harbor Inn on Mackinac Island. This is the original structure here today. If you want to stay there, you can. Obviously, they put porches on the front, but it's right one of the prominent places to stay on Mackinac Island, which was her residence. So she did very well in the fur trade, and largely just on Lake Michigan area. She's the one that granted the land right next to the house for the St. Anne's Church on Mackinac Island when they moved to a new structure in a slightly different location. And this is it today. After moving from Fort Dubois to Fort Michimil-Mackinac in 1708, and from Fort Michimil-Mackinac to Mackinac Island in 1781, the parish used the historic log church for decades, constructed the current church in 1874 on a donated site by the former fur trader Madeleine LeFevre, on the condition she buried there. And this is her tomb in the basement. We were just there this past summer. So she's very much commemorated. So really, our Potawatomi used to live in Michigan, especially around the St. Joseph River in this area, and then they moved down and along the Kankakee and up into Wisconsin a bit. So there was a gradual shifting once the Illinois Indians had somewhat moved again further to the west, and then didn't fare so well on the on the Mississippi. And the same thing in the Miami, they too emptied out. So a lot of the Indian groups, as time goes on, you see Le Renard there, the fox, and in this 1718 map, the area. And let me just, this is of course the Meskwaki Fox Indians, and their kind of dwellings, Potawatomi traditional dwelling with platforms, other things, and they give you Potawatomi dwellings. This is of course the Langford phase in-ground things, almost like a Mandan Lodge. And then the Winnebago, more into Wisconsin. But let me kind of end with a little bit of this. This is another Potawatomi married here to an Abram Burnett. It says, no Potawatomi squaw equaled her in regards to dress. She was plated with silver brooches. And these were Potawatomi who lived on the Kankakee River. Very local. And of course back to where we started. Well, what did Marie LeFevre look like? Was it on the right or on the left? Or these others? No, I guess I thought I had another woman in there. But anyway, but I'll stop there and open it up to any questions, contradictions, and whatnot. I hope I didn't bore you or put you utterly to sleep, but This is what I've been able to find about Monee.
Questions?
Any questions?
I have one.
Yes?
To your knowledge, have there been any excavations in the Raccoon Grove area?
Speak
From
a
my
little louder.
understanding, Last,
Art,
oh,
speak up.
sorry, okay. To your knowledge, have there been any archaeological excavations in the Raccoon Grove area? From my understanding, the last one conducted was in the 90s. And I'm bringing it up because I've heard arrow hunters are going in there and looting the sites, taking artifacts away.
Well, I was told that there are sites that are on the Illinois official, list of sites in Illinois. There are sites in the Raccoon Grove. I do not know of excavations there. Maybe Will can help me.
Sites
But-
plural?
Well, you think there's only one?
I don't know of only one listed.
Only one listed, okay. One listed. So, well, it depends on what you mean by a site, I suppose. There's nowhere in the Midwest that I have lived that I haven't been able to find an artifact if I really went out looking for it. Usually plowed fields, in some proximity to a stream, or some high elevation where perhaps even in the winter there could have been water flowing in the area. So I think with 10,000 plus years of Native Americans moving around seasonally, following the animals, following the food sources and whatnot, I think there are sites all over the place. And now if you mean habitation sites where there's going to be post moles and signs of fires and cracked rocks and this kind of thing, then I say, well, yeah, okay, there's a lot of those too. But or if you're talking about large village sites, the size of the one here in the sanctuary golf course thing, well, that, or Wampum Lake, then you're talking again. So, yeah, I think there are sites, many of them. I'm sorry to hear if they're being desecrated. You don't need to desecrate a site even to find artifacts, really. When you dig down, chances are, though, that usually some farmer has disturbed some of the soil before you anyway, even in areas that might now be wooded. All right. So what is undisturbed? I don't know. Now maybe further down, it's undisturbed. Maybe under the plow line. But at least some of you here can speak to current farm practices and knowing how deep they go.
One of the things that the Monee Historical Society has in its sights for down the road when we have a little bit more manpower and when we do have our permanent home is to really start digging into the Monee Native American past. If you speak to older families around, older farmers, almost everybody has in a shoebox or in a cigar box in their closet what they have found, and they can tell you where they have found it, but they won't because of the same kind of things like that they're afraid that they don't really understand that, will they be confiscated, will they go somewhere? So what we'd like to do is try to put together that history of where, they're all over around the edges of Raccoon Grove. I can tell you, I know of a few sites because people have shared that with me. I had an uncle who farmed right, it was Willard Pauling, and so that's Pauling Road. They had a farm out in the Grove, and he had a magnificent collection of arrowheads that he had found through the years in plowing, because they plowed with the horses at the time, of course, and his widow gave it away someplace, and I do not know where, but there's a nice collection of arrowheads at the Thornton Historical Society, and we just happened to cross them when we were there at a meeting, and they are all saying that they were found in the Raccoon Grove area. So I have an oral history, a farm out on Pauling Road that the woman's grandmother got the land, the original land grant in about the 1830s, and she would tell the story about how every year the Native Americans would come back to their farm to do, you know, I don't know, rites or religious rites, and they would visit it then, and they lived in harmony, but they farmed the land because it was now theirs. But it had been the Native Americans, and they kept coming back, and she had, you know, a couple of hammerheads I mean, just different artifacts that they had found on the property. So there is a lot of history of it in the area. It's just yet to be discovered and documented and put together, and that's something that we as a group feel very strongly we would like to do down the road. We just haven't had a chance to really get into it yet. So if you're interested in that, leave us your contact information. And what you're saying about the looting, I hadn't heard that that was going on, so that would be something we'd be interested in hearing more about as well, and seeing what we could do if that's happening and how not to.
Well, it's a loaded, you know, it's a loaded issue, because obviously sites to really be meaningful archaeologically, you know, obviously they can't be looted, and the idea is to stop the looting of it. On the other hand, you know, you will find artifacts. I have found artifacts in Thorn Creek Woods and on the path that everyone goes up and, you know, follows. So sometimes it's just, if you know what to look for, if you have an eye, you'll see it, but many other people won't. And on the other hand, if you really, really need an artifact, well, go on eBay. There's a lot of them there for sale if you want to buy them there.
Maybe
But
you can have a field trip.
pardon?
Take us all out. You can have a field trip. Take us all out and show us how to find them.
Well, a lot of issues here. Right.
Raccoon's county land, so you can't remove any stones, wood, rocks that you find on the property. The problem is you have hikers going in there from outside areas, you know, who don't live in Will County. They'll go in there and they'll scan, you know, the creeks and the paths, you know, and they'll pick up and collect these artifacts. They'll put them away and they'll take them for their private collections.
May I ask where you've heard this, or how you know this?
I hike all over the area. Raccoon Grove, Hickory Creek, Goodenow Grove, up near Bolingbrook area, Haddon Valley. I know a lot of hikers. I know what they do. I see people going in there all the time, Raccoon Grove.
Well, there's one area where there are trails, you know, in the northern part of it, but a lot of Raccoon Grove is so covered with leaf litter and other things of that sort that it would be very difficult, you know, to have any idea of where to look or where to find things. That's why I'm asking.
Well, as the professor said, it's not too hard to find the artifacts. You know, a sharp-tipped rock is going to stand out. Usually there's a varied color in it. An arrowhead hunter knows what to look for, and that they'll find it easily. Again, these are people passing by. They'll go to multiple forest preserves and collect what they can quickly and just take it. The problem I had was, like I said, I think I contacted our band and asked them when the last time they actually had a team go there, and it was the 1990s. So
Yeah, that was part of the South Suburban Airport
right,
survey.
the airport project.
Basically, archaeologists did a really comprehensive survey of everything that might be in the South Suburban Airport footprint or close to it. So they pretty much scoured the area for sites.
Right.
So that's you know, I don't think things have advanced enough since then to be able to. If they didn't find it in the 90s, it's probably not there. So, and I'm not going to tell you what I know of what is around. You know,
I just think it would be nice if there was some kind of digital repository or home institution where, say, a hiker or someone stumbles upon a rock, they can GPS map it, take a photo, or send it to someone who can put it in a collection so everyone can view it, as opposed to it ending up on eBay.
Well, that we can do. The Illinois State Archaeological Survey does have a collection identification project, which would include things exactly like that.
Sometimes there is a type of, they can identify the shape and the period, but it's, there are a few people who are really good at looking to see, in terms of the chipping, to give some clue to maybe what it may have been used to cut, or in other words, the use of that particular style blade. So a kind of a micro-analysis, which is not apparent. You could say, oh, well, sure, this is Mississippian, this is Middle Woodland, this is archaic. That's the typical type of thing, which reference books can kind of give you. But there are people, who can tell you a lot more, let alone where the stone is coming from, of which this artifact is made, in terms of its story of travel. What trails it followed, right? Anyway, what you present is a number of great issues.
He does have a sign posted at various places saying, please, if you find something documented on this website, kind of thing.
Other questions?
Do you have any other questions before we wrap up?
You mentioned Hubbard's Trace, the Vincennes Trail, and you mentioned that the Indians and the people traveling that were on horseback. And what about Hubbard? He's known as a swift walker. Did he use horses or?
I presume so. I presume so. No, I think, I think when you're into the 1780s and 90s, I think that's the first thing that people would do is buy a horse. Now, the Miami Indians were known to be walkers, but this is back maybe 100 years before. Just like some others were known for their birch bark canoes and traveling the waters, some were known for their overland trails and were not that much into long-distance canoeing or dugout canoes further to the south. So, I think, because when they talk about Tecumseh and these Indians, you're talking about Native Americans that were not hunting with bows and arrows. They had pretty good rifles. Well, some of them were getting them from the British, right out of the case. So, it's a little different scene. It's not the kind of thing. Right. Yes. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
There's tons and tons of refreshments.